Good afternoon, everybody. My name is David Ono with ABC7. It's always an honor to be here. I'm also on the board here of JANM, and these programs are invaluable, as you know. So it's my honor to be here today to be part of this program called Our Fragile Democracy, the role of state attorneys general in upholding the law in times of crisis. I mean, it's like you could say that again, right, in this world that we live in. But what more appropriate place to be gathered in the community than here at the Tateichi Democracy Forum at the Daniel K. Inouye National Center for the Preservation of Democracy at JANM. Just outside these doors is a site where democracy failed its people when Executive Order 9066 ordered people of Japanese ancestry to report here after being forcibly removed from their homes to be transported to concentration camps across the country. It seemed such a distant thing years ago, and suddenly now it seems more possible. At this time, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, the chair of the Japanese American National Museum's Board of Trustees, Mr. William T. Fujioka. Bill.
Well, good afternoon. You'll hear me repeat something that David just said, but it's important repeating. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Japanese American National Museum. Thank you for joining us as we host today's event, and we have this important discussion about the threats to democracy, and we're joined by Attorney General Rob Bonta. Our museum's primary mission is to preserve the history of the Japanese American community with the hope that what happened in 1942 never happens again to any other community. As David mentioned, this site is very important to us. Our museum was built here for a purpose. Outside, thousands of Japanese were removed from their homes and forced onto buses and eventually placed in camps in desolate areas of America. This was done without due process. Due process is one of the fundamental guarantees in our Constitution, but yet without any process, as in due process, 125,000 individuals of Japanese heritage were incarcerated. Like many nonprofit organizations, JANM is at threat of losing substantial federal funding because of our support of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Some nonprofits, because of that fear, are scrubbing their websites of any reference to DEI. JANM, because of our heritage and our history, we've taken a position to continue our support for DEI. JANM will scrub nothing. For a lot of you in this room, some of you are new to our campus, some of you are probably coming to the museum for the first time. The parallel for what happened to the Japanese community in 1942 and what's happening now is absolute, folks. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the Alien Enemies Act of 1798 was invoked, and hundreds of Japanese nationals were deported back to Japan. Closely following that, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which resulted, as I said, in the incarceration of 125,000 individuals of Japanese heritage. 2/3 were American citizens, and they were American citizens because of what's in the Constitution, the birthright provision of the Constitution. Every sansei in this room, and a lot of our trustees are sanseis, our parents became Americans through the birthright process. During this difficult time, it's important for all impacted communities to speak out against the injustices being committed by the current administration in Washington, D.C. I can't put the name on my tongue, but I'll just say the current administration because it makes me kind of gag a little bit. That gag reflex is tough. It's also important to have a leader like Attorney General Rob Bonta during this time of turmoil and madness. Attorney General Bonta has a personal and professional history of fighting on behalf of all marginalized communities. It's in his DNA. His parents laid the foundation for his commitment. They were deeply involved in the struggle for social justice, which included working with the United Farm Workers and other civil rights organizations. JANM is extremely grateful for Attorney General Bonta's actions and support. We're proud to stand with them during these difficult times. And so now it's my immense pleasure to introduce Attorney General Rob Bonta.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Rob Bonta, California Attorney General. Honored to be here with all of you. And thank you to Bill for that very kind and generous introduction, for the leadership you've shown so consistently over so many years. And it's great to join you for this important discussion. And a very important topic. Wish we didn't have to discuss it, but important that we are: the preservation of our democracy. And first and foremost, I want to shout out the Japanese American National Museum, JANM, for organizing this event, bringing us together. It's really important that we come together during these challenging times, that we see one another, that we see others fighting for the same values and future that we're fighting for, and to make sure we find one another and together are more powerful than we would be alone. And I don't have to tell you all that it's been a difficult time for many since President Trump took office. In a lot of ways, it's been a test to some of the very foundations that make up our democracy. I've often said our democratic institutions, our democratic pillars, they're being stress tested. And I will also say, so far they're holding as I've expected. They are durable and they are strong. And what's going to make them hold up is the most important pillar and foundation to our democracy, which is us, you, me, us, the people. A government of, for, and by the people is the heart of our democracy, and people will always have the first and the last word in what happens next. And so engagement is critical, participation, absolutely important. And the opposite of that is how democracies can shrivel and how they can die: apathy and ignorance and failure to engage and sitting on the sidelines. So democracy is, for better or worse, a full contact sport. We need folks in the game, not on the sidelines, participating and engaging. You are the choir. I'm speaking to you. You're here because you know that, but an important message to share with everyone in our networks. And I've had the chance to talk to Californians up and down the state: north, central, south, rural, urban, suburban, coastal, and inland. I've talked to workers and families and educators. I've talked to youth. I've talked to advocates and community members, persons with disabilities, elected representatives, and I've heard a constant message over and over in those conversations that there's a tremendous amount of fear, anxiety, confusion, worry about the future, about the chaotic and unlawful executive orders and funding cuts, about the closure of critical agencies and the end of vital government services. By the way, the services that are being cut at the federal level, the federal government services are critical. They are essential. They are not waste, fraud, and abuse. Healthcare for the poor, food for children, housing for those who need shelter. That is critical. That is essential. That is not waste, fraud, or abuse. There's a lot of concern over private citizen, unelected billionaire Elon Musk and his Doge army's unprecedented power and the president's proclivity for breaking the law time and time again. There's one thing the president has done consistently and frequently, unfortunately, it's breaking the law. He's done it blatantly, he's done it brazenly, which is why I'd like to take a moment to reaffirm to all of you right here, right now, that I'm here to protect, to defend, to enforce the rule of law, the Constitution, our state's laws, and our state's protections. And that means many things. It certainly includes representing all of America's beautifully diverse communities and ensuring that everyone can achieve their version of the American dream. So California DOJ, my office, my team, we are here for you. And you can be sure that if Trump breaks the law or violates the Constitution, we will see him in court and we will stop him. We already have. So far, in 19 weeks, we have sued President Trump 23 times. Do the math on that. That is more than once a week. And it is not because I and my colleagues, the Democratic Attorneys General, from the Canadian border to the Mexican border, from East Coast to West Coast, it's not that we gathered in a war room and said, hey, wouldn't it be great if we sued Trump once a week? We don't want to sue Trump at all because that would mean he's following the law and complying with the Constitution. What the President of the United States should do, not a lot to ask, that the President of the United States of America follow the law and comply with the Constitution. The thing, by the way, he raised his hand in the air and swore to uphold and to follow. And so anytime we sue the Trump administration, it's because of what he's done. If all we have is political grievance or policy or ideological difference, we cannot and we will not go to court. We will be thrown out of court immediately. We go to court when he's broken the law, including violating the Constitution, when we have the receipts, the legal arguments, and the factual presentation to win. And when we sue, we believe we will win. We've done our due diligence. We've done the analysis. We've gotten the declarations, and we have the facts. And so far, broadly, we have. In nearly all the cases where a court has issued an order, temporary restraining order or a preliminary injunction, we have secured it. And Trump has been blocked from conducting his unlawful action. And so we will continue to do that. I think two of the first cases that we brought, the first two actually, are representative of that broader body of 23 lawsuits that we brought. Trump is doing two things generally. He is attacking fundamental rights, constitutional rights, like the right to vote, like the right to be a citizen if you're born on American soil, the 14th Amendment Citizenship Clause, which ensures birthright citizenship to those born here in the United States. That's sort of one bucket of cases that we've brought to stop his actions. The other type of case is to address an action that we've seen applied to many different aspects of the federal government, which is Trump trying to stop, block, some people use the word impound. I think that gives it too much dignity and formality. Already congressionally appropriated funding. Congress has the power of the purse. Congress has the power to spend. Congress has the power to appropriate. The president does not. The president's job is to execute the laws of the legislature. And when Congress makes decisions about the budget, the president is supposed to execute them and carry them out, not block them, not add additional conditions, not change them. And it is a fundamental violation of the separation of powers, a core constitutional principle that we've all learned about in grade school that this president does not seem to understand. And so on day one, literally day one, not figuratively, on January 20th, the day he was inaugurated, President Trump issued an executive order seeking to, with one signature of his pen, amend the Constitution and revoke birthright citizenship. A constitutional right, right there in the 14th Amendment in black and white, a constitutional right that's been upheld by the US Supreme Court multiple times, including a critical case right out of California, San Francisco to be exact, the Wong-Kim Ark case, which reaffirmed what the Constitution says, that if you're born on American soil, you shall be a citizen of the United States of America. And this, by the way, was after a lot of talk on the campaign trail about not going after all immigrants, but just undocumented immigrants who were violent, who were hurting other people. And that was the rhetoric, that was the narrative, that was the talk. But the action on day one was not even going after immigrants, going after children, going after Americans, going after US citizens. So frankly, a very undemocratic, un-American executive order. Hours after the president signed this executive order, we went to court to block this action. And we secured an injunction that blocked this unlawful, unconstitutional action by the president. And this, one of the judges who opined on this issue in Washington State was really telling. He was a Republican appointee, appointed by Ronald Reagan, been on the bench for 4 decades, and said this was one of the most blatantly unconstitutional acts he had ever seen, and that it was blatantly unconstitutional, and he couldn't fathom how even the Department of Justice, United States Department of Justice attorneys could, in good faith with their duty of candor to the court, present the arguments that they were making to him. And that shows the level of the violation and how clear it was. And that also, this isn't partisan. These are judges just calling it like they see it, applying the law to the facts, let the chips fall where they may, making a decision. And this is not a close case. Last month, I was in Washington, D.C. There was a U.S. Supreme Court oral argument on this case, not on the core issue of whether birthright citizenship says what it means, what it actually says, but on an adjacent related issue of nationwide injunctions and a question of whether certain states, not all, here it's usually some subset of the 23 Democratic Attorney General states, can go to a court and get an order, secure an order that doesn't just apply in the states to the people in the states that are represented as parties, but could apply nationwide. And if you think about how that applies to a constitutional right, it's clear that a nationwide injunction is appropriate in certain circumstances. We've never said all cases deserve nationwide injunctions. We've also said some cases do deserve nationwide injunctions. And it doesn't make sense and defies common sense to suggest that people living in blue states where their AGs bothered to fight for their constitutional rights should have birthright citizenship rights in the Constitution for everyone in the United States. But those in red states, half of the states, where their AGs did not bother to fight for their constitutional rights, should not. And so we think we have a very strong argument about the applicability of a nationwide injunction in this particular case. We feel confident that that will be the ultimate decision of the U.S. Supreme Court. And in this case, on the substance, as it continues to percolate, we believe the president has overstepped his authority by a mile, and we will continue to hold him accountable. A second case, which represents the other type of major unlawful action that the Trump has taken repeatedly, was exemplified by the Office of Management and Budget memo, OMB memo, that sought to freeze $3 trillion nationwide of already congressionally appropriated funds that were dedicated and Congress had required be spent for housing and health care, for food programs, for college, for child care, for public safety, for disaster relief. Congress passed the budget, a president had signed it, and this president thought, hey, you know what, I don't think that's how we should spend the money, I'm gonna hold it. And we did our analysis in California, we had $168 billion of federal funding at risk. That was supposed to flow to California, but this memo sought to halt and block and hold. And I remember I was coming back from an event in the evening on the West Coast, towards the end of the evening, and we got word of this memo. We, being Democratic Attorneys General, we started communicating with each other. It was getting towards midnight on the East Coast. And we decided that it was our duty and responsibility to file a lawsuit the next morning about a case that we just learned about as we were speaking. And so we marshaled our resources, we created a plan. Some of our team members worked through the night, and we filed the complaint the next morning, and we halted the blocking of the $3 trillion of funding, so that money continued to flow and fund critical and essential services for Americans and people in our nation who needed them and deserved them. So those are two examples that capture a lot of what the president is doing. There's certain other cases with DOJ trying to access private information. We have our tariffs case as well, where there's no authority for the president to issue tariffs against all of our trading partners, and he's acting beyond his authority. But the common thread is this is an administration that seeks to exercise authority it doesn't have. The President of the United States, perhaps the most powerful elected office in the nation and the world, has a lot of authority. He is welcome to act within his given authority. He is prohibited, and he will face lawsuits every time he acts outside of his authority. And we are also suing the Trump administration for unlawfully imposing immigration enforcement requirements on billions of dollars of U.S. Department of Transportation and U.S. Department of Homeland Security grants. He's trying to leverage federal funding, again, that the Congress already appropriated to the states, and add conditions that Congress didn't put on this funding to fit his agenda and his goals. And these are grants that are completely unrelated to federal civil immigration enforcement. This is a coercive use of the spending power of the federal government. It's unlawful, and we have sued President Trump on that case as well. It's very clear that the president can't conscript our state's resources, can't commandeer local law enforcement resources or other resources to support their anti-immigration agenda. The federal government has the ability, the authority to enforce immigration law. They can do their job, but if they do it lawfully, but they cannot force states to do their job for them. And so we will be immovable and resolute in that position, and we already have good law here in California and throughout our western state region, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals upholding that law and upholding SB 54, California's California Values Act. We're also focusing on ensuring accountability and transparency for the federal government. One way we're doing that is by arming the public with information. As soon as Trump was elected, we did a number of roundtables, including here in LA, up and down the state, talking about immigrant rights, talking about the duties and obligations of healthcare facilities and workplaces and schools, of local law enforcement under California's laws, what they can do, what their rights are, what they are prohibited from doing. We also released reports taking a closer look at how immigration detention facilities, for-profit private immigration detention facilities in California are operating, what the conditions are of confinement. They're awful, and we made that clear with our reports. So we will continue to share with the community important information about the rights that they have, that were meant to be exercised in certain moments when they're under risk and under threat. Now is one of those moments, and we will continue to provide truth, tell the truth, seek the truth, and provide transparency and accountability. We've had a number of other lawsuits where we've pushed back against the attacks on what the Trump administration calls DEI, what I call efforts to tackle harassment and discrimination. We've had lawsuits to protect our environment, protect the Department of Education from being dismantled, protect AmeriCorps, America's core service and volunteerism program from being gutted. We got an injunction today that was announced indicating that the volunteers and those seeking to serve their fellow Americans can continue to do that through the AmeriCorps program. We've been able to prevent massive cuts to Health and Human Services Agency, and the list goes on. We unfortunately don't think we're going to stop at 23 lawsuits. We hope we will. It would be great if we could, but we're only 19 weeks in, and we have 23 lawsuits. We are at double the pace of Trump 1.0. In Trump 1.0, California brought just over 120 lawsuits in the 4-year period. We'll hit 120 in 2 years at this pace, unfortunately. So it's consistent with the articulated theory by the Trump administration to flood the zone, to have shock and awe, to create confusion and chaos, to try to have an overwhelming volume of actions that they believe the opposition, those who care about the rule of law and the Constitution, can't respond to. But we have, each and every time the Trump administration has violated the law and hurt our states, and we've had standing to go to court, we've sued. And that is our commitment and our promise to continue to do for as long as it is necessary. There's been some talk about, from the president, some Stephen Miller in particular, complaining about all of these court orders against the Trump administration that he finds to be inconvenient and getting in the way of their implementation of their agenda. And it's very simple. As soon as they stop breaking the law, we'll stop suing them in court. But as long as they are breaking the law, we will continue to sue them, and we will continue to stop them. As AG, it's my job, I've always seen it, my job as fighting for the underdog, the little guy, the vulnerable, those who have been abused or harmed or cast over or forgotten. And that means making sure that the rule of law protects everybody and applies to everyone. And it means making sure that everyone follows the law, including the President of the United States. No one is above the law. Mr. Trump thinks he's above the law. He's not. He thinks he doesn't have to comply with the Constitution. He's wrong. And the rule of law is the bedrock of our democracy. And it's the bedrock of our economy, of our rights and our freedoms, of everything that makes our country great. And we can't allow anyone to bully us into obedience or silence. And that sounds obvious, but it's not obvious right now. Some are letting the Trump administration bully them into obedience and silence as they violate their rights. People in my own profession, law firms, took a knee and capitulated and acquiesced when faced with a completely unlawful executive order. Instead of doing what they do every day, which is fight and litigate and defend your rights and use the rule of law as a shield and a sword. And so courage is important right now. Standing up and fighting for what's right, fighting for the rule of law, fighting for our democracy, fighting for the Constitution. So I want you to know that no matter what is thrown our way from Washington, D.C., I will be here upholding the law, pursuing justice, and showing bullies and bad actors that I and we won't back down. I know you won't either. I know that there's so many across this country who, as they feel that concern, that anxiety, that worry, are looking west to us, to California, the great state of California, largest state in the nation, most diverse state in the nation, now the 4th largest economy in the world, the state that has led to the phrase, as California goes, so goes the nation. And they're wondering what we do. And what they will see is California fighting for our rights, fighting for the rule of law, fighting for democracy. So, thank you for having me. It's going to be a long 4 years. We're off to a fast start, but we are committed to our principles and our values, and I know that together we're going to make it through, and we will be stronger on the other side. Thank you.
Attorney General Bonta, thank you so much. We're a little tight for time, but that was a phenomenal speech, and we have a spirited conversation coming. We have a number of distinguished panelists with us. They've dedicated their careers to civil rights and social justice in their respective work, and we invite you to learn more about each speaker from the bios that were provided as you walked in, and you could also use a QR code to learn a bit more about that. So let's get right into the introductions. Ann Burroughs, President and CEO of Japanese American National Museum. We're all familiar with Ann. Thank you so much, Ann. Connie Chung right next to me, CEO Asian Americans Advancing Justice, Southern California. We have with us Lisa Holder, President, Equal Justice Society. Lisa, thank you. And Mr. Thomas Saenz, President and General Counsel, Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, or MALDEF. Thank you so much. Let's get right to the conversation. Let me turn my page here. And I think it's appropriate that we start with you.
I'll go with that.
Okay. In light, and playing off of what the Attorney General had just been discussing, the Trump administration has this growing list of executive orders, many of which target marginalized communities, restrict protest, attack culture. You're the president of JANM. This entity right here is really has been on the front lines of that for the last many years. This community understands how difficult this could be for a community. First of all, what is your take on what this current administration is doing, and what are your concerns, especially knowing the history here?
Thank you, David. Just again to welcome everybody here, and it's amazing to be on this panel of just extraordinary people, especially these lawyers that are a little bit daunting, so I have to watch my superlatives and wild generalizations. But I think that, it's a very fair point, David. We're at, as Bill said in the opening remarks, he spoke about the power of this place and the importance of this place. You spoke about the history. And I think I want to go right into talking about how extraordinarily courageous our trustees have been and how extraordinarily courageous JANM has been in the face of all of this. Within 2 weeks of January the 20th, our trustees came out with an unbelievably strongly worded statement in defense of civil rights, in defense of democracy, and in defense of history. We were the first museum in the country to do it, and for almost 2 months we were the only museum in the country to do it. So the reason why the trustees did it is because what Trump was doing was deeply personal. For each of our trustees, their parents, their grandparents had been forcibly removed, they'd been incarcerated. So what Trump was doing with the revocation and the reintroduction of the discriminatory laws that had been used against their families and used against other communities meant that it was extraordinarily personal. But the other reason that they stood up, and I think that this is important to note, is that in 1942, nobody stood up for Japanese Americans. For our trustees, it was time for JANM to stand up for everybody else. When there'd been silence in 1942, it was important for the trustees to stand up now. And it wasn't just in defense of history, but it was also in order to preserve the civic space, which I think is so important. And for us at JANM, memory is critically important. Memory is an act of remembrance, it's an act of resilience, but it's also an act of resistance. Not just for the sake of resistance, but it's in order to ensure that we're able to use history to show people what happens when there's an abuse of power, when there's an overstepping of power, to talk about the impact of that. That's extraordinarily important. But it's also about defending the civic space. So what we do here at JANM, it's important for us to be able to have these conversations where we can bring people together, because we know that in authoritarian states, the world over, in authoritarian governments, that civic space gets shrunk. And what happens then is that people are silenced. When they're silenced, they're paralyzed. When they're paralyzed, they're fearful. And when they're fearful, they're complicit. And we can't allow that to happen here. So for our trustees and for JANM, the position that we've taken is very much using that memory, but using it in a creative way, not just to protect and defend, but critically to build community and to build engagement in that civic space. Because if we don't do that, it's very hard to think about what an optimistic future can be. So we feel an enormous sense of obligation to building that future. And when I hear the Attorney General speak, it's extraordinary to me that we have leaders like him in California, how lucky we are to have those leaders. The other point that I want to make, and I also want to bring the Attorney General into the conversation, is that he led an incredible movement of 22 state attorneys general to go after the Trump administration to release the funding from the Institute for Museums and Library Sciences. All of us, all cultural institutions in this country, we've been affected by those cuts, by the cuts to the NEH, by the cuts to the NEA. And those are assaults on the culture of this country. And those are assaults on the civic space. Because if you don't have that funding, if that's cut off, we strangle. So thank you for that. And I would love to hear from you about what your thinking was and just how important you feel culture is in all of what you talked about earlier on. Thank you.
Sure. Well, we were saddened to see the action by the Trump administration, but grateful for the opportunity to push back and fight for funding for our museums and our iconic cultural spaces. And a lot of what the Trump administration is doing is going after people and places where critical thinking occurs, where truth-seeking and truth-telling occurs, where learning occurs. I mean, he's going after Harvard University. He's going after our museums. He's going after the press. He's going after the courts, places where justice can be done and people can be hauled in and be held accountable. It's all red team versus blue team, and attacking the guardrails of our democracy. And so our Constitution, in some ways, I've reflected on this, is built for this moment. It made a decision in its writing, and it says, there shall be no kings, no tyrants, no monarchs, no autocrats. And all the power in this great nation is going to be spread. It's going to be dispersed. It's going to be shared. It's going to be shared through the three branches of government. It will be shared vertically with the states and the local governments as well. And so what you see Trump doing is an ongoing effort to consolidate that power and pull it from the places it's been separated into and pull it into one unified executive branch. But this is someone who talks about alternative facts, calls judges, so-called judges, who denies elections. And so places that tell the truth and remember history and remember moments that are teaching moments and that are relevant moments to today are a threat to his ability to implement his agenda. So we want to protect those places. And so we protect law firms and their right to represent the people that that want to have a great attorney. They represent our museums and our cultural centers who are telling important stories, and places of institutional knowledge, protect the press and the courts as well. So we're grateful for JANM and all the museums and cultural centers that have continued to speak truth, tell stories, and advance our democracy.
Fantastic. And beautifully stated. And we won't be erased. Buy the T-shirt. It's in the gift shop. So, Lisa, how is the fight for racial justice linked to the struggle to preserve and expand democracy? And what does that mean to protect democratic structures in a system built on racial exclusion?
David, thanks for that question, and so appreciative to JANM and the Attorney General's office for convening this conversation, and so delighted and honored to be included with this illustrious group of stars. To answer that question, David, I kind of have to break it down into its three subparts, the way I see it, And the first question, the first subpart is, why is our democracy so fragile? So fragile that it is deeply compromised in a flash. Our democracy is a fledgling. It's a newborn. It really is only 75 years old. And it began when we ended legal segregation with Brown v. Board of Education. And it's really misguided for us to think that our democracy started in 1776 or even in 1865 with emancipation. But since we are dealing with a newborn, a fledgling, it is critical that in order to sustain our democracy, we have a supermajority of people who support multiracial inclusive democracy. That's what Brown v. Board of Education was about. It was about the beginning of multiracial, inclusive democracy. And maybe if we start thinking of our democracy as a newborn, as a fledgling, maybe we'll do more to protect it. Anyone with tyrannical ambitions can easily exploit our fledgling democracy and our democracy's Achilles heel, which is America's racial pathology. And that is what's tearing us apart in this very moment, America's racial pathology. Some of what Attorney General Bonta talked about, let's be honest, many of these policies that we're seeing our apex predator promulgate are really about further marginalizing people of color who have been marginalized for so long. And so what is America's racial pathology? It is this entrenched belief that a certain set of people are more deserving than others, and that the wealth of this nation needs to accrue to that subset first, foremost, and often exclusively. And that racial pathology began in 1619 with the enslavement of Africans and the genocide of Native Americans. And it continues as a constant through line that we see today in outcomes that show, for instance, that Black and Indigenous people remain at the bottom of all social indicators of full citizenship. And not because of individual failings or a lack of industry on the part of this subset, but because of systemic defects and defaults that continue to replicate inequality and place greater burdens on Black and brown people, and the anti-Black and brown narrative that embeds implicit bias and replicates this perception that this subset is inherently less deserving. Okay, so like any decent lawyer does, I establish my factual predicate, right? So those are the two things that we're concerned with here, America's racial pathology and the fragility of our fledgling democracy. So what do we need to do to strengthen it and preserve it and expand it? All right? Remember, the best defense is a strong offense. So we need to focus on two things. We need to focus on the narrative, and we need to focus on policy and programs and expansive laws for civil rights. So when we focus on the narrative, this is what racial justice work is about. Let me break it down for you. A focus on racial and reparative justice that moves the narrative away from a white supremacist narrative and normative culture toward a multiracial narrative that resonates with and supports everyone. I use the term often multiracial inclusive democracy, and people are like, what's that? That's a lot of big words. Okay, look around the room. This is what multiracial inclusive democracy looks like. Okay? And this conversation and this convening, this is the narrative transformation that we need to shift toward a multiracial inclusive democracy. Secondly, we need to look at law and policy that repairs the harm and rehabilitates systems designed to exclude Black and brown and AAPI people so that the people who were harmed and stymied systematically are made whole systematically and finally given equal opportunity and access to America's robust resources. The last thing I'm going to say here is that it is no coincidence that the first laws that A.G. Bonta talked about and that Anne talked about and policies were attacks on our cultural institutions, our educational institutions, on JANM, institutions like JANM, institutions like Harvard that said we're going to stand 10 toes down for diversity, equity, and inclusion, and on concepts and paradigms, thought paradigms like critical race theory pedagogies. What do all these things have in common? They shine a spotlight on an endeavor to remedy America's racial pathology in a race-conscious way that promotes full citizenship for allyship among and inclusion of a diverse majority of Americans. You, JANM, are targeted because you have the power, the will, the skill set, and the community credibility to shift the narrative and our culture to one that is inclusive and truly democratic.
Well said. Lisa, thank you. I want to bring Thomas and Connie into the conversation. I'm going to give you both kind of a hybrid question here that's similar, and that is, it has to do with the executive orders that are aimed at immigration, at deportation, which are heightening fear, especially in the Latinx community, but also, Connie, with you, we've seen the Alien Enemies Act revived. Both of these are creating a great deal of fear, and almost it brings back past chapters in our history. Thomas, first of all, what is MALDEF doing to address this issue? Do you have a strategy against it? How do you fight this?
Well, David, I think it's first important to note and absorb that the fear that you describe is by design. It has been the practice of Donald Trump and his acolytes since the election, even before inauguration, to seek by threat, to seek by innuendo, to create fear in the population, not just the undocumented population, but in related populations. So think about that. An elected leader, a central part of whose agenda is to create fear in a large portion of the population. And we are talking a large portion of his constituency. The United States is now 19% Latino in population, but it's not only Latinos, as you note. It's the API community. It is through other fear tactics, the transgender community, the LGBTQ community writ large. It is every person of color because of the demonization of DEI as somehow relating or constituting unlawful discrimination. So it is a concerted policy of this administration to scare people. And that means that MALDEF and everyone, elected leaders at state, local, national level, civic leaders, need to, number one, ensure that we are not contributing to the fear, because that actually furthers the agenda. And that means perhaps being even more circumspect about reacting to what the administration is engaging in. Much of what is happening is quite threatening and quite scary. But we have to avoid contributing to a fear campaign that is with respect to the Latino community aimed at two ends. Number one, they have been more or less explicit about their desire to drive a large number of quote unquote self-deportations, not working in particularly large numbers, but that's the design. But secondarily, and not acknowledged as openly, this is really about deterring powerful civic engagement by the Latino community. We in the Latino community constitute the biggest threat to Donald Trump and his acolytes simply because of the size and growth of the community. When they talk about the racist great replacement theory, they are talking about the growth of the Latino community and how uncomfortable it makes them. So we do have to engage in an effort that we wouldn't in other circumstances in doing civil rights work, which is number one, not contributing to the fear, but number two, really ensuring that people not only know that they have rights, because there is obviously a strain of this fear campaign that suggests undocumented immigrants and others don't actually have rights, but know that they do have rights and what those rights are. And that's an important supplement to the civil rights work that always occurs. But I think it's important also to note something that happened just yesterday. And I want to note it because it is such a demonstration of the extent to which this administration will go together with allies to subvert the rule of law. And it's also important to note because it involves the complicity of another attorney general. MALDEF is a national organization involved around the country. This involves the Texas attorney general, a great contrast from our attorney general. And that is, if you didn't see it in the news yesterday, the U.S. Department of Justice filed a lawsuit in federal court. They chose the court, chose the judge, by engaging in the kind of judge shopping that we have seen in the last decade. It filed a challenge to Texas's law providing that certain undocumented immigrant students can pay a lower tuition rate in public universities and colleges in Texas. Texas was actually the first to pass that law. California was second, but by the way, our proposal was out before Texas's was. But so this is one of the long-standing laws providing for so-called in-state tuition for undocumented immigrants. Department of Justice files yesterday afternoon a challenge to the state of Texas. Within minutes, if not hours, within hours, if not minutes, the state agrees to a consent judgment with the plaintiff United States to end in-state tuition in the state of Texas. In other words, the state attorney general agreed to end a law that was duly enacted by the state legislature, that the state legislature has considered changing as recently as this year and chose not to, but within hours, if not minutes, agrees to a consent judgment, and the judge, inappropriately, signs a final judgment in that case within hours of it having been filed. Now imagine that. There's no emergency, there's no exigency, there's no reason not to deal with that requested consent judgment as a normal motion involving weeks before a public hearing where the public could choose to appear as friends of the court or even as potential interveners to weigh in on the consent judgment. That judge didn't wait, didn't set a hearing, didn't ask for additional time, signed within hours of the case being filed a final order from a federal court ending in-state tuition for undocumented students in the state of Texas. Now that is an extraordinary undermining of our judicial system and the rule of law in this country. But it is also a clear illustration of the challenge that we face to do the work that you've asked about, David, but it also epitomizes what we are seeing with this administration, which is that people's experience in this country is going to differ state by state more than it ever has in our history, perhaps. And that is, if you're in a state like California with good, progressive leaders who understand democracy and the rule of law in charge, you're going to have a better experience than if you're in a state like Texas where none of those things exist. And that's why the work becomes even more challenging given, as the Attorney General explained, the need to file so many lawsuits. We have to really deploy our resources carefully. And we have to decide where is the greatest threat and where do we have to act.
Thomas, thank you. Very important information. Connie, I mentioned the Alien Enemies Act. It smacks of Chinese exclusion. It smacks of the incarceration of Japanese Americans. It's creating fear. What's your take on that? What can be done about that?
Thank you, David. I think the first thing to remember is I think as a general public understanding, people don't always associate immigration with AAPIs. But it's important to remember 6 out of 10 AAPIs are immigrants, which means the vast majority of us are either immigrants or from immigrant households. So we are deeply impacted by what's happening today. We are seeing every day within our communities our community members being detained. They are being deported, often to third-party countries. So you have people who are Vietnamese speaking or Chinese speaking now being deported to countries like Panama or Costa Rica or South Sudan, where there's no language access, there's no due process. Our community members are deeply, deeply impacted by what's happening with immigration. The second thing I'd like to mention is that immigration has been used in this country and continues to be used as a racialized tool. Who we choose to let into this country, keep out of this country, and expel from this country is very much right now about communities of color. And that is the past history. You look at the Chinese Exclusion Act that said if you are of Chinese descent, you are not allowed to be a citizen of this country. You're not allowed into this country. And that was expand into other Asiatic countries. You see the travel ban that was just passed this week, and you see which countries those bans are in. They are all Black, brown, Asian countries. The student visas that the administration has said, if you are a Chinese international student, your visa will be revoked. You are not allowed in this country. It feels very much like the Chinese Exclusion Act. It is very racist. And then think about the fact that this administration has welcomed with open arms white Afrikaners from South Africa. That is the one group that, the administration says, come on in. Everyone else is not. So let's not separate that immigration is very much a tool to keep communities of color, including the Latino and API communities, out of this country or expel them from this country. I will also mention that anti-Asian hate, which is something that we saw rear its ugly head during COVID and continues to be a problem today, but has been a problem throughout history, is also correlated with what we're seeing. Certainly, we saw it in World War II with the incarceration of Japanese Americans. We saw it during COVID, where we were hearing, go back to your country, go back to China, all of those things, and so many attacks. And it's important to note that when we're seeing people being mistreated and what we're seeing is this anti-Asian bashing or this perpetuation of you are an outsider, you are not to be trusted, and you do not belong to this country. And that is the rhetoric that's coming out of the immigration administration, and that has a direct impact on anti-Asian hate. And we see that correlation, and we continue to see problems with anti-Asian hate today. And then the last thing I want to mention is the issue of how important it is right now to think about cross-racial solidarity as these attacks are happening. Right now, this administration is creating this narrative that tries to say we are enforcing immigration laws because there are bad immigrants. There are criminals that need to be expelled from this country in order to create a safer country for America. And I want to call bullshit. That is so unbelievably untrue and patently false. If that were the case, then why do we have ICE agents who now go to courthouses and are waiting for people there? As somebody who has worked in the domestic violence field for over 15 years, I will tell you, domestic violence victims will not seek restraining orders, and they will stay with their abusers and continue to accept harm rather than face the idea of going to court and then being deported and separated from their children. When we have ICE going into our schools in South LA, going after children, 2 different schools going after kids from kindergarten to 6th grade, lying to school administrators saying that these children, this is a welfare check, these are with guardians' permission, only for the school administrators to find out that is all a lie. For ICE to go in and lie their way into getting to schools to take children and detain them. Children are not criminals. What ICE is doing and their behavior is criminal. And so we as Americans need to remember that. And I don't care what your race or nationality is, because I think we need to remember that these types of behavior is un-American. And whether it's the Latino community, African immigrants, or APIs or others, often these tools are being used to, we can't allow ourselves to be pitted against other communities of color, which is often the tool that's used to keep us always separated and apart. But we remember that this narrative is incorrect, because I think what we saw with this last administration, with this last election, is that it worked, that many of our communities, and I will include the API community, were split between those who were more willing to vote for this administration, and they felt more alliance to that kind of messaging. And we cannot let that happen. We cannot forget that as communities of color, it is only by sticking together, and right now with what's happening with this rhetoric around immigrants, that it's important to remember that our democracy relies on us continuing to follow the rule of law and continuing to be the type of country that treats people with humanity, and that we have constitutional individual rights, no matter where you come from, what the situation is, that we will treat people with a certain level of dignity. And I just wanted to mention that, Attorney General Bonta, you have spoken so eloquently, and I've heard you speak several times about your personal history and your parents being Filipino Americans and that solidarity with the Latino community. And I just want to say that I think it's that kind of reminder that we need right now in this country.
Fantastic. we have a panel of 5 keynote speakers. This could go on all day, but we're out of time. I would love to give the Attorney General a chance to do some final comments before we close out today.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to join you today. I appreciate it, and I'm inspired by all of the great leaders up here that I'm honored to be on this panel with. And maybe I'll make it personal for a second here in response to the comments about my family. And I think about them a lot right now. In fact, my mom texted me when one of the students was taken off the street and arrested and detained, and she said it feels like the Marcos dictatorship all over again. And for someone who fought through that for 14 years, my mom, after growing up in the Philippines and looking my dad in the face when I was born and asking if they could raise me then and guarantee that I had freedom and democracy and human rights and the rule of law and due process, and deciding no, because they saw Marcos coming. They saw the dictator on the verge, and martial law was imposed exactly a year from the date of my birth. So my parents brought me to California because they wanted those things for me. So it's with no small amount of irony that I find myself in a position I never thought I would be in. As California Attorney General, I'll just tell you, I'll confess to you that sometimes I secretly go on our website to see if my photo and my name are really there on the Cal DOJ website, because I never expected it, and I get very excited when it's there, because it means I can bring more lawsuits against the Trump administration to support the rule of law and our democracy. But now we're fighting for our democracy. I don't want to over-dramatize it, but I think about my parents a lot because my mom refused to accept something that to her was unacceptable, and to normalize something that was so abnormal, that people's rights would be taken away, that their ability to vote for their elected officials and representatives would be taken away. And so she fought for 14 years. And like old school grassroots fighting, like me and her, like her young son, grabbing signs and chanting slogans and marching with the people, and doing it year after year as the crowds grew and the voice got louder until the dictator was chased out of the country, never to return, and democracy was restored. I had a dad who was a grad student at Cal in 1965 and had a friend across the country sending him audio cassette tapes of this incredible leader who he wanted my dad to just hear for the first time because he knew he'd be inspired, and it was the voice of Martin Luther King Jr. being sent through the mail to my dad. And he was inspired. It was his call to action. He jumped on a train. He went to Selma, Alabama. He met Stokely Carmichael. He was in Brown Chapel AME Church when Martin Luther King Jr. himself showed up to give an unannounced sermon. And he listened to Martin in Selma in the middle of the Civil Rights Movement. And when my parents brought me here, they knew that you can't just look out the window, hope, and wait for the things that you want. You got to go get them. You got to go create them. Change doesn't just happen. People make change happen. So they started working for the United Farm Workers of America. They started collecting signatures outside of supermarkets as part of the lettuce boycott. We got invited to move to La Paz. We lived in a trailer in La Paz. My dad worked in the front office with Cesar Chavez. My mom worked in the preschool with Dolores Huerta. It was a movement originally started with the Delano Grape Strike of 1965 and the great Larry Itliong and the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee, who reached out to Cesar Chavez and the National Farm Workers Association, and they said, let's not be pitted against one another. Let's join forces and be undeniable and unbeatable. And they did, and they created the iconic United Farm Workers of America. And I saw everyday people look out into the world and demand that tomorrow be more fair than today, that it be better and more just. So I just want to end on that people power is the most potent power that there is. It is the heart, the beating heart of our democracy. It makes us go. We decide what will happen next. And so I know some of us are concerned and worried, but I want to say to you, don't feel hopeless because we're not helpless. We have power, we have authority, we have agency, but we have to fight. And so that point about democracy is a full contact sport. We got to stay in this game. We got to stay engaged. We got to stay enraged by the abuse of power. We got to stay outraged by these frequent violations of the law. We can never normalize it. It's never okay. There's a lot of chapters still to be written in the story of California, in the story of America. and it's you and me and us who are going to write it. Thank you.
Phenomenal. Well said. Well said.